before that Nehemiah is my favourite book in the whole Bible. And some background to the book, by way of introduction. The book was written about 450 years before Christ. The Jews had been in exile for about 150 years. Firstly in Babylon, where the Babylonians had invaded Israel and carried them off into exile into what is now Iraq. And the only ones who were left in Jerusalem were the old, the sick, and the handicapped. Sometime later, the Babylonians themselves were conquered by the Persians, but the Jews remained in captivity. And in time, the Jews would settle down. They were established in Persia, in what is now Iran. And this is the kind of environment that Nehemiah would have been born into and raised. Nehemiah had never seen Jerusalem. He would only have heard about it. His home was in Susa, which was the capital of the Persian Empire. His friends, his family would all have been in Susa. He was educated in Susa. He worked in Susa. Susa was his life. And Nehemiah was a real high flyer. He was a man on the way up. And it says that he was a cupbearer to the king. Now, when we hear the words cupbearer, we don't think of the butler. We don't think of the servant. We don't think of the man who brought the king a drink when he was thirsty. Nehemiah's main job was to keep the king alive. He was in a position of great authority, a position of respect. He would often be in the presence of the king, not just to taste the wine, but he was also there in matters of importance, matters of state. The king would have confided in him. He was a man of great influence who could be trusted with the king's life. Now, this is not just a job that you stumble into by accident. This is a job that you're handpicked for. The king would have recognized visible qualities of leadership in Nehemiah. A stable, incorruptible character, a man with a sharp mind, a man of common sense, a man of initiative, a man of loyalty. These are all things that the king would have recognized in Nehemiah before he appointed him to the position of cupbearer to the king. This is also someone that the king would not find easy to replace if he left his employment. On top of all this, Nehemiah would have had a very comfortable lifestyle. He'd have lived in a palace. He'd have enjoyed the best of the Persian health system. He'd have had a pension packet. He'd even have a new camel, probably a GTI model of a camel. The one with the 3 humps, you know the one I'm talking about. He's got the very best of everything. A very comfortable lifestyle. But then in verse 2 we read that one of his brothers turns up. Dave, can you put up the verse? Try and stay with me.
I'll try.
So at least if one of us gets lost, we'll have an idea what's happening. His brother turns up, Hanani. And in verses 2 and 3, Nehemiah is presented with a problem. And he asks his brother, how are the remnant doing in Jerusalem? And the Hebrew word here for asked is shawal. It means to earnestly seek an answer. Nehemiah is genuinely concerned with the state of the people in Jerusalem. Now, in some ways, Nehemiah is far removed from Jerusalem. He's 800 miles away and 150 years away from what happened. His position in the court may have led him to say, well, that's a shame, but it's not my problem anyway. But that's not who Nehemiah was. Nehemiah was presented with a problem, and he knew that he had to do something about it. These were his people. And the Bible tells us that he wept when he heard the news. And the Hebrew word here is bokau. It gives a sense of being in terrible grief, and at times wailing in agony over the hurts of his people. I wonder where we last wept to this degree over the hurts of our people. Nehemiah was someone who dealt with reality. There was a problem, and it had to be dealt with. Now, some people deal with problems by pretending they're not there. It's as if by closing their eyes and pretending they're not there, somehow the problem would disappear. It's like the ostrich burying its head in the sand. But of course we know that when we do that, what happens is the problem gets bigger and bigger. Nehemiah understood that integrity and honesty don't ignore problems. But his initial response was to weep. He saw things as they were. He saw people who were in great distress, great difficulty, and he was overcome with emotion. So he prayed and he planned. Think back to the last really important decision that we made. How much time did we spend in prayer before making that decision? And if we did we wait until we were sure that God had spoken to us before we acted on it? I know for me, so often I try to do things in my own strength. I try to do it in my own strength instead of taking important decisions to God before I make them. And if I do pray about it, often I will go ahead and make the decision anyway, hoping I've done the right thing. And I'm not really sure God has spoken to me. Thankfully, Nehemiah worked very differently. And the prayer from verses 4 down to verse 10, I think, is one of the best prayers in Scripture. And it's a wonderful example to us of how we should pray. Nehemiah's prayer begins with thoughts about God and then moves on to confession of sin. And it's only after this that he brings his request to God. When Nehemiah prayed, he stood in reverence and awe before the Lord. He recognized above everything else that was going on around him that God was sovereign. And for Nehemiah, the greater God became in his life, then the smaller his problems appeared to him. He was a man who was desperate for God to work a miracle, but his only thoughts are on praising God first. Then he goes on to confess his sins as a member of the Jewish people. Now, the fact that the Jews were in captivity was nothing really to do with Nehemiah. He wasn't even thought of 150 years beforehand. But he includes himself as a sinful member of the Jewish people who are still disobeying God. And it says that Nehemiah prayed this prayer for 4 months. He prayed from Kislev to Nisan, from December to March. And this would not have been a 2-minute prayer. This is something that would have consumed Nehemiah. He prayed and he waited on God. And as he waited, he began to realize what part he would have to play in the answer to his own prayer. As he prayed, he realized he would have to make a plan. And that plan would involve a great change in his life. He would have to reorder the things that were a priority in his life. But before he could do anything, he had to find favour in the eyes of the king. It says in verse 10. The king would have to be willing to let Nehemiah go. And this would have been no small matter. The king would have to be willing to let go of someone who was extremely important, not only in his life, but in the life of his whole empire. And humanly humanly speaking, it's very, very unlikely the king would have granted this request. And that's why Nehemiah prayed what he prayed in verse 11. Give your servant success today by granting him favour in the presence of this man. But the important thing is that he prayed and he waited. And it was through the waiting before the Lord and hearing what God was saying to him that Nehemiah began to see things with a much clearer perspective. But the waiting involved having that problem on his mind the whole time. He didn't just pray and say, well, that's that done. Carry on now. He prayed and he continued to pray. New Testament description of he persevered in prayer, day and night. And he persevered until he was sure that God had spoken to him. And he knew that God had spoken to him. And it was only after he was sure of what God had said that he began to put his plan into action. And if we read through the rest of the book of Nehemiah, we find out that God did grant him favour in the eyes of the king. And one more thing to consider here is that this answer that God gave him would have involved great personal cost to Nehemiah. His position in the court, his palatial residence, all the benefits that came with being in his position would all have to go. But he knew it was what he had to do because this is what God had told him to do. And it would have taken Nehemiah about 53 days to travel from Susa to Jerusalem, travelling an average of 15 miles a day on a camel through the desert. Not a very comfortable journey. For Nehemiah, it wasn't even a consideration. Nehemiah's heart was in Jerusalem. His love for the people, his love for his God was more important than the difficulties that he was going to face. Nehemiah simply met problems head on. Nehemiah wanted to make a difference. Nehemiah had a big heart. We are surrounded by people with problems in Beaconsfield. Perhaps not the same kind of problems that the remnant in Jerusalem feel. As I drive around Beaconsfield, I don't see many broken down walls. I don't see many gates burned with fire. There are not many outward signs of people who are in distress. Beaconsfield is an affluent town, and maybe that helps to mask some of the problems that are there. But there are people in Beaconsfield who are suffering huge financial crisis at the moment. I know this because a recent Christians Against Poverty course in Beaconsfield was oversubscribed. People needing help managing their finances and their debt. There are marriages at straining point in Beaconsfield. There are broken homes. There are children spending one weekend with one parent, next weekend with the next parent. Children caught in the middle of a spousal war. There are people in Beaconsfield grieving the loss of loved ones. There are people in Beaconsfield who are facing serious or terminal illness. There are people in Beaconsfield who are shut in and left from one weekend to another. Lonely people. There are people in Beaconsfield who are addicted to drugs, to alcohol. There are children who are bullied at school. From this list of problems, I can describe impeccably. I think the fact that the saving grace of Beaconsfield is that there doesn't seem to be a problem with gangs. But the problems here are the same as they are in Peckham. They're no different. How do we respond to this? Either as individuals or as a fellowship? As a fellowship, I've always been hugely encouraged by the number of groups and the activities that take place here, and the way that this church tries to reach out to the community, to draw people in. Events that seek to reach people of all ages. And I would hope that at some time during those events, those people with problems would feel comfortable enough to open up and share something of what's troubling them. But it's as individuals that we can make the biggest impact. And again, we have two choices open to us in a way that Nehemiah did. The first thing is that we can have a small heart. And this is by far the safest way to go, because it minimises all the sorrows that we will face. Because if we involve ourselves in the lives of other people, we will face difficulties. We will face challenges. We will face sorrows. One of the roles that we had in Africa was as pastoral care of the short-term workers who came out every year to help us. These were young people, fresh-faced, very enthusiastic to do what God had asked them to do. And we were responsible for their pastoral care in the time that they were with us. They poured themselves in what God had asked them to do. But for me, after several years of greeting these people, of investing time in them, of discipling them, and then seeing them leave at the end of the year, and then waiting for the next batch of key recruits coming in, it became painful as the constant getting to know people and then saying goodbye to them began to wear me down. It was hard. It was just easier not to make the effort. And that's what happened in the last couple of years I was there. I just couldn't do it anymore. Until my daughter, one day, who was probably 12 or 13 at that time, said that not only were they missing out because I wasn't really involved myself in their lives anymore, I was missing out too. I was no longer contributing into their lives. I had grown a small heart. Something I had to remedy. We can have a small heart, it's very safe. Or we can have a big heart. We can have the kind of heart that makes us vulnerable. The kind of heart that's open up to pain, to sorrow, as we share our lives with people that we want to minister to in this time. People who have real need of help. For those who come into the various meetings or groups in this church, as well as the people we meet out there in the streets, our friends, our families, our acquaintances, they all have problems. And yes, we may experience more pain as we open ourselves up to people, but we'll also experience far more joy as well as we see people's lives being changed. And we'll see changed lives, not only the people we try to minister to, but our own lives being changed as well. Nehemiah had a big heart, and by going to Jerusalem, he opened himself up to a whole world of trouble. But if you read through the book of Nehemiah, you read that he became intimately involved in the lives of the people that he went to minister to. And he helped to change their lives and helped to change their circumstances. We're right here, we're still at the start of 2015. It's not too late to make late New Year's resolutions. How about making one this morning to increase the size of our hearts? To actively seek to involve ourselves in the lives of the hurting people here in Beaconsfield. Involving ourselves in the lives of those that come into the fellowship for the various meetings and groups that we have. By involving ourselves in the lives of the people that we come and see around us, I believe that's the whole function and purpose of the church, is to reach out to those in need. doing this, we ourselves will become changed people as a result. We're going to have a time of intercessory prayer just now. But what I'd like us to do, first of all, is just to have a few moments of quiet, just to reflect. Reflect on ourselves. Where are we as individuals at the beginning of this year? Ask ourselves, how big is our heart? What is God saying to me at the start of this year about the difference I can make in the lives of other people? Just a few moments of quiet reflection on that, and then we'll have a time of intercession.